The gun was already in her hand when he walked through the door. Louise Slater stood in the center of the room she had called home for exactly 11 days, her arm extended, her fingers steady in a way that her heart was not. The lantern on the table threw amber shadows across the rough-hewn walls of the sheriff's office, and in its flickering light, the man who filled the doorframe looked nothing like the villain she had been promised he was. "You are Jeremiah Rourke," she said. It was not a question. She had memorized his description from the wanted poster: 6 feet of trouble, dark hair, jaw like a decision made too late. The poster had not mentioned the way he looked at her. It had not warned her about his eyes. He raised both hands slowly, deliberately, the way a man does when he has been in this position before and has learned that sudden movements end conversations permanently. His gaze traveled from the barrel of her Remington to her face, and something in it shifted, not fear, not even surprise, but something quieter and more dangerous than either. "I am," he said. "And I'm guessing you're the woman who sent the telegram to Judge Harlan, saying she had evidence against me." "I am." She used his own phrasing back at him without blinking. "Then we have a problem," he said, "because the man who gave you whatever evidence you're holding is the same man who put 3 bullets in my deputy and burned the Miller family's homestead to the ground last March." The air between them changed the way air changes before lightning strikes, electrically, invisibly, irrevocably. "That is a lie," she said, but her voice carried the faint crack of a woman who had told herself that lie too many times to fully believe it anymore. "Miss Slater." He said her name like he had practiced it, like he had been carrying it around in his pocket. "I never expected you. When I rode back into Cassidy Creek tonight, I expected a trap. I expected Marshal Donnelly's men waiting in the dark. I expected a lot of things." He paused. His hands were still up, and there was something almost unbearably honest about the gesture. "I never expected you." She held the gun for 3 more seconds. Then she lowered it, not because she trusted him, not because she believed him, but because somewhere in the most hidden room of her chest, in the place she had locked and bolted and sworn never to open again, something moved. She had stopped expecting anyone. She had stopped expecting anyone to walk through doors and mean something. She had stopped expecting voices to carry weight. She had stopped expecting the world to send her anything other than more of the same, more hardship, more betrayal, more proof that the universe was profoundly indifferent to her survival. And yet here was Jeremiah Rourke, standing in her lantern light with his hands raised and his eyes doing something she could not name, and the world had apparently not gotten her message. It had sent her something unexpected after all. The story of how Louise Slater came to be standing in a sheriff's office in the town of Cassidy Creek, Colorado Territory, in the autumn of 1878, with a loaded gun and a broken theory, began the way most catastrophes do, with a letter. She had been living in Abilene, Kansas, which was not quite as wild as its reputation suggested, but was wild enough to make a woman careful. She had been careful for a long time. Careful was another word for lonely, but it was a loneliness with structure, and she had learned to prefer structure to the alternative. Her late husband, Thomas Slater, had been dead for 2 years. He had not been a bad man. He had not been a particularly good one either. He had been a man of middling virtue and considerable debt, and when the fever took him in the summer of 1876, Louise had found herself with a modest house, an immodest set of financial obligations, and a grief that was more complicated than mourning was supposed to be. She had grieved, yes, but she had also felt something she was ashamed of: relief. Relief that she no longer had to pretend that her life was the life she had chosen, rather than the life she had fallen into at 22 because it had been offered, and she had not known to wait for something better. She was 27 when Thomas died. She spent the next 2 years paying off his debts, which she did by working as a bookkeeper for a hardware merchant named Abrams, who paid fairly and asked nothing inappropriate of her. She was 29 when the letter arrived. It came from a woman named Clara Hennessy, who had been Louise's closest friend since childhood, before Clara married a rancher and moved west. Clara's letter was warm and rambling, and full of the kind of detail that Louise loved: descriptions of the Colorado sky, of the way the cottonwoods turned gold in October, of the peculiarities of small-town life. But buried in the fourth paragraph, between a digression about the price of flour and a complaint about the lack of decent fabric in the local dry goods store, was a sentence that changed everything. Clara wrote, "There is a situation here that I believe you are uniquely suited to address, Louise, and I would not ask if I did not believe it with my whole heart. Our sheriff, a man named Cole Whitmore, is investigating a range war that has left 3 families ruined and 2 men dead, but he has received threats against his life and is afraid to pursue the one man he believes is responsible, a railroad man named Gerald Fitch, because every witness either disappears or recants. I remembered that you worked briefly for a railroad surveying company before your marriage and might know something of how such men operate. More than that, I remembered that you are the bravest woman I know, even though you have forgotten it yourself." Louise read that letter 4 times. Then she wrote back to Clara and said she would come. She told herself it was because she owed Clara a visit she had postponed 3 times. She told herself it was because Abilene had grown stale and she needed the change. She told herself it was not because she was lonely in the specific way that only people who have stopped expecting company can be lonely deeply, architecturally, in the bones of the thing. She arrived in Cassidy Creek on a Tuesday in September, 1878, on a stagecoach that smelled of leather and other people's anxiety. Clara met her at the stage stop with a hug so fierce it bordered on painful, and in Clara's embrace Louise felt the specific ache of someone who had been touched too rarely. Cassidy Creek was a town of perhaps 400 souls, spread along a creek that ran fast and cold out of the mountains to the west. It had a main street of 8 establishments, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse, a mill, and the kind of surrounding ranch land that could make a man wealthy if the weather cooperated and the cattle didn't die. It also had, Clara explained in a lowered voice as they walked from the stage stop to Clara's house, a significant problem. Gerald Fitch had arrived 18 months earlier as an agent for the Denver and Pacific Railroad, which was planning a line through the territory. The railroad, if it came, would be transformative, but it would also require land, and the land it required was land that was currently occupied by homesteaders and small ranchers. Fitch had initially attempted legitimate purchase negotiations, but when several landowners refused to sell at the offered prices, things had turned dark. A barn burned here. A well was poisoned there. A man named Daniel Miller was found dead in a ravine, officially ruled an accident, and his family sold their land the following week for a quarter of its value. Sheriff Cole Whitmore had his suspicions about Fitch, but Fitch was careful. He operated through intermediaries, hired men who could not be easily connected to him, and he had the backing of the railroad company, which had lawyers and money and political connections that made Whitmore feel very small. Whitmore had written to the territorial marshal's office asking for assistance and been told to be patient. He had written again and been told to gather evidence. Clara's husband, Owen Hennessy, owned a mid-sized cattle operation that Fitch had approached twice with offers to buy. Owen had refused twice, and Clara was frightened that a third approach would come with fire instead of money. What Clara had not mentioned in her letter, what she told Louise only after dinner, with Owen gone out to check the cattle and the 2 women sitting by the fire with cups of tea going cold between them, was that there was another complicating element. There was a man named Jeremiah Rourke. Rourke had a history in Cassidy Creek that predated Fitch by several years. He had worked as a deputy to the previous sheriff, a man named Alderson, until Alderson died of a heart complaint. He had left town afterward under circumstances that Clara described as unclear and involving some kind of accusation that most people here don't fully believe. He had been gone for 2 years when Fitch arrived. He had come back recently, Clara thought about 3 months ago, and no one was quite sure why, or whose side he was on. Fitch had been loudly and publicly accusing Rourke of being the source of the violence. He had presented Sheriff Whitmore with documents, contracts, letters, records of transactions, that he said proved Rourke was intimidating landowners on behalf of himself or unknown parties. Whitmore was not sure what to believe. The documents were convincing, but something about them bothered him in a way he could not articulate. Louise asked Clara what she herself believed. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think Gerald Fitch is the cleverest and most dangerous man I have ever seen, and I think he is very good at making people believe things that are not true." 3 days after Louise arrived, Sheriff Whitmore was thrown from his horse and broke his leg in 2 places. The doctor said he would be off his feet for 6 weeks at minimum. Whitmore, lying in bed with his leg in a splint and his face the color of old paper, asked Louise if she would be willing to take on a particular task. He had been in contact with a territorial judge named Harlan who had agreed to come to Cassidy Creek and look into the situation personally if someone would gather the necessary documentation. Whitmore had been doing that work slowly and secretly. His files were in the safe in the sheriff's office. He was deputizing Louise to access them, organize them, and add to them whatever she could learn, and then send word to Judge Harlan when she had enough. "Why me?" Louise asked. Whitmore looked at her steadily. "Because Clara Hennessy says you are the cleverest woman she knows, and because you have no history in this town that anyone can threaten or use against you. You're a stranger here. Fitch doesn't know who you are. And because I am lying in this bed and I don't have a lot of other choices, Miss Slater." She accepted the deputy's badge he offered her. It was small and slightly tarnished, and it meant something to her that surprised her, not the authority of it, but the weight of it, the sense of being trusted with something that mattered. She spent the next 8 days in the sheriff's office, going through Whitmore's files, cross-referencing dates and names, building a picture of what had happened in Cassidy Creek with the methodical patience she had developed as a bookkeeper. She was good at finding the thing that did not fit, the number that refused to align, the name that appeared in 2 places it should not have. It was the same skill applied to a different kind of ledger. She found several things that troubled her. Among Whitmore's documents were the materials Fitch had provided implicating Rourke. She read them carefully 3 times, and on the 3rd reading she noticed what had bothered Whitmore without his being able to name it. The documents were too clean. They were too convenient. The dates aligned too perfectly. The language was too consistent, and one contract bore a signature that, when she compared it to other examples of Rourke's signature that appeared in legitimate town records, did not quite match. The letter form of the capital R was different. It was a small thing. It was the kind of thing that only someone who spent her days looking at numbers and letters would catch. She had not yet decided what to do with this when she found something else entirely. In the bottom drawer of Whitmore's desk, in a leather folder he had labeled simply "Private," she found a second set of records. These were not official documents. They were notes in Whitmore's own cramped handwriting, and they told a different story, one in which Gerald Fitch had a business partner whose name did not appear in any of the public documents, a silent investor who had been providing Fitch with the capital to pursue land acquisition more aggressively than the railroad's official budget allowed. The name of that silent investor was Marshal Thomas Donnelly, the territorial marshal, the man Whitmore had been appealing to for help. Louise sat with that knowledge for a long time. The afternoon light moved across the floor of the sheriff's office, and she did not move with it. She understood now why Whitmore's requests for assistance had been met with patient non-responses. She understood the shape of the trap that had been built around this town and the people in it. She also understood that she was now in possession of information that made her extremely dangerous to powerful men, and that she was a woman alone in a small town with no allies except a friend whose husband's ranch was already a target. She sent the telegram to Judge Harlan that evening, carefully worded, giving nothing specific, simply saying that she had gathered sufficient material and requesting his immediate presence. She sent it from the telegraph office, and she was aware as she sent it that the telegraph operator was a young man named Price who had an unsettling habit of looking at her with too much calculation in his eyes. She went back to the sheriff's office and she waited. And then the door opened, and Jeremiah Rourke walked through it. After she lowered the gun, they stood in that peculiar stillness that follows the decision not to shoot someone, and Louise thought that she ought to say something definitive, something that established the terms of this encounter. What she said instead was, "Sit down. I have questions." He sat. He moved with the deliberate care of a man who had learned to make himself small in spaces that felt unpredictable. And there was something in the way he lowered himself into the chair across the desk from her that suggested he had been carrying a long and heavy weight for quite some time. She set the Remington on the desk between them within her reach, a gesture that was both a concession and a warning. "Tell me about the documents Fitch showed Whitmore," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and she had the impression of being evaluated, not in the way men sometimes evaluated women, with an assessment of surface and usefulness, but in the way a person looks at another person when trying to determine if they are safe to trust. She found she was doing the same thing back. "How much do you already know?" he asked. "More than you might expect and less than I need. Tell me about the documents," he told her. He talked for almost an hour, and as he talked, Louise listened with the particular quality of attention she brought to ledgers, noting what fit, what didn't, what answered questions she had already formed, and what opened new ones. Jeremiah Rourke had been born in St. Louis in 1845, the son of an Irish immigrant father and a Missouri-born mother. He was 33 years old. He had come west after the war, in which he had served as a Union soldier and seen things he mentioned only obliquely and did not dwell on, in the way of men who have processed their worst experiences down to a small hard residue they carry without examining. He had drifted for several years, working cattle drives and occasional law work, before ending up in Cassidy Creek in 1873, where the previous sheriff, Alderson, had hired him as a deputy. He had been good at the work. He had been good at reading people, at de-escalating situations that wanted to become violent, at the patient, investigative work of understanding why things happened the way they did. Alderson had trusted him. The town had, by and large, tolerated him, which was the most you could say about most places and most people. Then Alderson died, and everything went wrong. The town council had chosen not to promote Rourke to sheriff. They had brought in a man from outside, a man named Cole Whitmore, which was their right. Rourke had no argument with Whitmore himself. What he had an argument with was Gerald Fitch, who arrived 6 months after Whitmore took over and who had, within weeks, demonstrated an unsettling ability to put himself at the center of every transaction in town. Rourke had watched Fitch and not liked what he saw. He had said so to Whitmore, who had listened politely and done nothing. He had said so to several of the ranchers who were being approached by Fitch, and some of them had listened, and some had not. He had been trying to build a case against Fitch, informally, without official authority, because he had no badge anymore when the accusations against him started. First it was whispers, then it was formal complaints to Whitmore. Then Fitch presented his documents, which purported to show that Rourke had been approaching landowners with threats on behalf of unnamed parties who wanted to acquire their land. The documents were, as Louise had already noted, fraudulent. But they were good forgeries, and Whitmore, under pressure from Fitch and from Marshal Donnelly, had warned Rourke to leave Cassidy Creek. Rourke had left. He had spent a year working out of Pueblo, still gathering what information he could, still trying to build a case from a distance. Then he had heard that Whitmore was starting to come around to his perspective. The sheriff had written to him privately, cautiously, saying he had found some irregularities and Rourke had come back. He had come back to try to finish what he started. He had come back because Daniel Miller was dead, and the Miller family had been run off their land and someone had to answer for it. And because There was no one else positioned to do what needed doing. He had come back knowing it was a risk, knowing Fitch might use his return as an excuse for more accusations, knowing Donnelly might move against him. He had not, he said with the directness of a man who had stopped decorating his truths, expected to find a woman with a Remington in the sheriff's office who had already put half the pieces together before he arrived. Louise looked at him when he finished. She looked at him the way she looked at a set of accounts when she suspected they told a true story, with her head slightly tilted, her eyes narrowed, sorting signal from noise. "The signature on the Fitch documents," she said. "The capital, are you write it differently?" Something changed in his expression, not surprise exactly, but a kind of careful attention. "You noticed that?" "It was the first thing I noticed once I started comparing." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Sheriff Whitmore told me he thought there was something wrong with the documents, but he couldn't figure out what. He is better at people than paper. That's a different skill. And you are better at paper. I spent 4 years as a bookkeeper. You develop an eye." Another pause. The lantern flickered and threw new shadows, and in the shifting light she became aware of him differently, not as a problem to solve or a suspect to assess, but as a person. A person who had been carrying a dark past through a landscape that kept offering him new reasons for bitterness, and who had chosen, apparently, to keep fighting anyway. "What do we do?" he asked. "You sent the telegram to Harlan, but Price is Fitch's man. He almost certainly told Fitch you sent it, and Fitch will know exactly what it means." "I know, which means Fitch will move before Harlan arrives." "I know that too. How long until Harlan gets here?" 4 days at minimum, possibly 5. He absorbed this. Donnelly's office is in Denver. If Fitch telegraphs Donnelly tonight, Donnelly could have men here in 2 days. "Then we have a 2-day window," Louise said. "To do what?" "To make sure that by the time Donnelly's men arrive, the evidence is already in Harlan's hands and out of our reach. If we can get the documents to Harlan directly, rather than waiting for him to come to us, then even if Donnelly moves against us, it's too late to suppress it." Rourke looked at her steadily. "You want a ride to meet Harlan. Someone does. That's a 2-day ride toward Pueblo through country where Fitch's men patrol." "I am aware." "You're a woman alone with a deputy's badge from a sheriff who is currently incapacitated. If Fitch's men stop you, then they stop me," she said. "But if I stay here and wait, Fitch has 2 days to prepare, and prepared is the one thing we cannot allow him to be." Rourke was looking at her with an expression she could not entirely read, part assessment, part something that looked, unexpectedly, like admiration. She told herself not to notice it. "I'll ride with you," he said. "You are a wanted man in this territory. Fitch's accusations aside, there's no actual warrant out for me. That may not stop Donnelly's men." "No," he agreed. "But 2 people riding together have twice the eyes, and a better chance of making the right decision when something goes wrong." "And something," he said, with the flat certainty of a man who had learned this through extensive personal experience, "will go wrong." She considered this. She considered him, the steadiness of him, the absence of performance. He was not trying to impress her. He was not posturing. He was making a practical argument in a practical situation, and the argument was sound. "All right," she said. "We leave before dawn." They spent the next 2 hours preparing. Louise gathered Whitmore's key documents from the safe and organized them into a leather satchel, prioritizing the evidence against Donnelly, which she correctly identified as the most explosive material. Rourke went to see Whitmore briefly to inform him of the plan. Whitmore, unable to move but still alert, gave his blessing and told Rourke where he kept a second horse in a livery 2 streets over, outside the range of Fitch's usual observation. Clara was told only that Louise was leaving for a few days on official business, and that she should not, under any circumstances, mention Louise's whereabouts to anyone. Clara gripped Louise's hands and said, "Please be careful," and Louise said she would, and they both knew the promise was the best either of them could do. In the hours before dawn, Louise lay on the narrow cot in the back of the sheriff's office and did not sleep. The town was quiet in the specific way that small towns are quiet at 3 in the morning, a quiet that felt less like peace and more like held breath. She thought about Thomas, which she rarely allowed herself to do. She thought about how she had arrived at this place in her life through a series of choices and surrenders, and how strange it was that the thing that had finally made her feel genuinely alive was also the most dangerous situation she had been in since she was 12 years old and walked 3 miles home alone in a Missouri winter. She thought about Jeremiah Rourke's eyes in the lantern light, and she told herself firmly to stop thinking about that. At 4 in the morning she rose, checked the Remington, put on her riding clothes and went to find him. He was already waiting with the horses. He had packed efficiently and lightly, a bedroll, a rifle, 2 canteens, enough food for 3 days. He had also brought an oilskin cover for the satchel of documents, which she had not thought of, and the thoughtfulness of this detail struck her with a warmth she had not anticipated. They rode out of Cassidy Creek as the sky began its first tentative lightening in the east, a bruised purple that promised sun, but had not committed to it yet. The trail they took went south before turning east, avoiding the main road where Fitch's men were most likely to be found. Rourke knew this country well. He had ridden it for 5 years as a deputy and knew which draws hid water and which ridgelines offered sight lines. For the first hour they rode in silence that was not uncomfortable. Louise was occupied with the combination of alertness and exhaustion that comes from a sleepless night in a charged situation, and she had found long ago that the best thing to do with that state was to inhabit it quietly rather than try to manage it with talk. Apparently Rourke had found the same thing. He rode without the need to fill space, and she was grateful for it. It was full light when he said, without preamble, "Tell me about yourself." She glanced at him. "What would you like to know? Whatever you're willing to say. We have 2 days of riding, and the best insurance against panic is knowing who you're with." It was a practical framing, and it made her smile slightly despite herself. That is an unusually sensible reason to ask someone about their life. I'm an unusually sensible person. When I'm not being impulsive. Have you been impulsive recently? Coming back to Cassidy Creek, he said, without hesitation. I knew it was a risk. I came anyway because it felt wrong to leave the situation unresolved. I have a strong aversion to unresolved situations. As do I, she said. And then, because the morning was wide and the horses were moving at an easy walk, and something about the openness of the landscape had lowered her guard slightly, she told him. She told him about Abilene and the hardware merchant's books. She told him about Thomas in the flat, honest terms she had learned to use when thinking about her marriage, not angry, not grieving, just truthful. She told him about the letter from Clara and the moment she had decided to come west, and she tried to explain what it had felt like to be handed a deputy's badge and feel the weight of something trusted in her hand. She did not tell him about the loneliness. That was too large and too close to name. He listened without interrupting, which was the rarest thing she had encountered in conversation. When she finished, he said, "You built a life out of what was given to you and made it enough to work with. That takes more strength than most people know." She looked at the horizon. "I am not sure it was strength. I think it was mostly stubbornness." "Those are often the same thing," he said. They stopped to water the horses at a creek around midday, and while the horses drank, they ate the dried beef and hard biscuits he had packed and talked about the case in practical terms. What documentation they had, what was still missing, what Judge Harlan would need to take action against Fitch and Donnelly. The conversation had the focused energy of 2 people who are genuinely good at the same thing working together, and Louise felt something she recognized with a jolt as enjoyment. She had not enjoyed herself in a long time. She had been content sometimes, and functional frequently, and occasionally even pleasantly occupied. But enjoyment, the kind that happens when the person next to you is genuinely interesting and actually listening, and makes you feel, oddly, more yourself rather than less, that had been absent for years. She tucked the observation away and did not examine it. The trouble came in the afternoon. They were picking their way along a trail that ran through a narrow canyon, Cottonwoods pressed close on either side, the creek running to their left, when Rourke pulled his horse to a stop so abruptly that Louise's mare nearly walked into him. What she began. "Listen," he said quietly. She listened. The canyon had gone silent in the specific way that canyons go silent when something has moved through and startled everything that was previously making noise. "Riders," he said. "Ahead, maybe two. They stopped when we did. Fitch's men, could be, or could be anyone." He turned his horse slowly, scanning the canyon walls. "We could back out and take the ridge above, but it's open ground up there and they'd see us. Or we could go forward and see who it is and hope for the best." "There is a third option," Louise said. He looked at her. "Let me go forward alone. I am a woman alone on a horse. I am considerably less threatening than you are, and if they are Fitch's men looking for us, they will be looking for a man and a woman together, not a woman alone." He was already shaking his head. "You and the satchel will go up the ridge," she continued, overriding the headshake. "If they stop me and I cannot talk my way through, I will stall them long enough for you to get distance. The documents are what matters." "The documents are not what matters," he said, with a flatness that surprised her. She met his eyes. Jeremiah, it was the first time she had used his name and they both noticed it. "Louise," he said, with the same quiet weight. "I did not ride through the night and into a canyon to leave you to face armed men while I run for the ridge. I am not asking you to run. I am asking you to protect the evidence. The evidence will mean nothing if something happens to you. That is a logical fallacy. The evidence is—" "I know what the evidence is," he said. "I know exactly what it is. I have been working toward this for 2 years, and I am telling you that the calculation you are trying to make leaves out a variable." He paused. "You are a variable I am not willing to leave out." The canyon was quiet around them. Somewhere high above, a hawk turned in the white afternoon sky. Louise felt something in her chest shift with the slow inevitability of tectonic plates. She recognized it. She had felt something similar once, a long time ago, before she had learned to stop. She had felt it and acted on it and been disappointed by it, and then she had spent years rebuilding the walls, and they had been very solid walls, well constructed, properly maintained. They were apparently not as solid as she had thought. "All right," she said. "We go forward together." They went forward together. The riders ahead, there were 2 of them, as it turned out, were a pair of cattle hands from a ranch east of the canyon who had been checking fence lines and were merely curious about who was passing through. They exchanged brief nods, said nothing of consequence, and continued on their way. Louise let out a breath she had been holding for 10 minutes. Rourke looked sideways at her. "You calculated that better than I did." "I was less certain than I sounded." "So was I." They rode on. The afternoon lengthened and cooled toward evening, the sun dropping behind the western mountains and painting the sky in colors that Louise had not seen in Kansas. A deep saturated crimson that became orange, that became a green gold near the horizon that was almost impossible. "Lord," she said softly. He looked at the sky. "The territory does that sometimes," he said. "Makes you feel like the world was made this morning just for you." She looked at him looking at the sky, and she thought that she had not expected this either. She had not expected him to say something like that. They made camp in a shallow hollow that Rourke knew from his years of riding this country. A spot sheltered from the wind by a rock outcropping, and close enough to a seep spring that they could refill their canteens. He built a fire small and low, the way a man builds a fire who knows that light is visible from a distance, and they ate the remainder of the food he had packed and drank coffee he made from a small tin he produced from his saddlebag, with the air of a man who considers good coffee a non-negotiable element of survival. The coffee was very good. Louise wrapped both hands around the tin cup and let the warmth work its way up through her palms. "You said you were a deputy here for 5 years," she said. "From 73 to 78, with a gap in the middle when I left. Did you ever think about leaving for good?" He was quiet for a moment, poking at the fire with a stick. "After they accused me, I thought about it every day. The reasonable thing to do was go somewhere else and start over. There is no shortage of territory in this country. But you came back." I came back because leaving felt like agreeing with what they said about me. He paused. And because of Daniel Miller. His wife and 3 children are in Denver now, in a boarding house, living on what relatives could spare. He was a good man who tried to hold on to something he had built, and it killed him. I could not make that something that happened in a town I used to protect and then just went about my life. She looked at him across the fire. The flames threw light that softened nothing in his face but illuminated everything, the lines of it, the history of it, the particular set of a jaw belonging to a man who had made a decision and lived inside it without flinching. "I am sorry," she said, "about what was done to your reputation." He met her eyes. "I am sorry you came into this situation carrying other people's mistakes. I came willingly." "You came because Clara asked, and because you're the kind of person who responds to someone needs to do this. That doesn't mean it's fair." "Very little about this whole thing is fair," she said. "Gerald Fitch is a man who looked at 4 families who had built lives from nothing and decided their lives were worth less than his profit margin. Marshall Donnelly looked at his badge and his duty and decided his bank account was more important. Those are moral failures of a particular kind. The kind that destroys other people's lives and rarely faces consequences. It will face consequences this time," she said, and she said it with a certainty that was not performance. It was conviction, and it was real. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said quietly, "I believe you." The fire crackled. The night around them was immense and cold and full of stars. "Tell me something about yourself," she said. "Not the case, something else." He thought about this. "I read," he said. "I have read every book I could find since I was 8 years old. My mother used to say it would ruin my eyes and also that it was the best habit I ever had in the same sentence, which was very much like her." "What do you read?" "Everything. History, natural science. I read a treatise on astronomy once that I found in a trading post between here and Pueblo, left by someone who had no more use for it. I spent 3 weeks reading about the stars." He looked up. "I find it useful to know what I am looking at." She looked up too. The Colorado sky was enormous, and the stars were not the pale suggestions she had known in Abilene but blazing, declarative things. "Which one is that?" she asked, pointing to a very bright star directly overhead. "Vega," he said. "Part of the summer triangle, though it is getting late in the season for it. That bright cluster to the east is the Pleiades. The Pleiades are mentioned in the book of Job. You read the Bible." "I read everything," he said again, and there was something in the simplicity of it that she found more attractive than she could reasonably account for. She thought about the last time she had talked with someone for hours and not looked for the exit. She thought about Thomas, who had been a decent man but who had had little interest in anything outside of his work and his meals and his modest social circle, and who had never once asked her about the stars. "I need to sleep," she said. "Yes." He stood and began arranging the bedrolls. He placed his on the far side of the fire from hers with a care that she recognized as deliberate courtesy, establishing a comfortable distance without making it awkward. "I'll take the first watch and wake you in a few hours." "I can? You have not slept since yesterday morning." "Sleep." He said it the way you say something to someone you have decided to take care of, not as an order but as a declaration of intent. She lay down on the bedroll and pulled the blanket up and looked at the stars through the gap in the rock outcropping above, and she thought about how strange it was that she felt safe. She was lying on the ground in a Colorado canyon with a man she had met 6 hours earlier at gunpoint, in the middle of a situation involving at least 2 dangerous men with resources and motives and connections. She was exhausted and in possession of documents that powerful people wanted suppressed. And she felt, for the first time in a very long time, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She slept. He woke her at 2 in the morning with a light touch on her shoulder, the kind of touch that is calibrated not to frighten, and she was awake immediately in the way of people who sleep lightly in charged situations. "Your watch," he said. "I don't expect anything, but I heard a coyote moving strangely about an hour ago. Might be nothing." She sat up, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders against the cold. He handed her the second tin of coffee, still warm from the remaining heat of the fire. "Thank you." He settled into his bedroll. She thought he would fall asleep quickly. He had the quality of a man who could sleep efficiently, without ceremony, but he said from the other side of the dying fire, "Louise." "Yes." "Whatever happens tomorrow, with Harlan, with Fitch and Donnelly," a pause, "I want you to know that I am glad it was you." She looked at the coals. The coldness of the high-altitude night pressed in around the small warmth of the fire. "I don't know what I expected when I came here," she said. "I think I expected to do something useful and go home." "Is Abilene home?" She considered this seriously. "I am not sure it has been for some time. What is home for you?" She thought about it for a long moment, and she told him the truth, which was something she rarely did when it came to this particular subject, because the truth sounded too much like longing, and she had taught herself to be careful with longing. "I think it is a place where someone knows who you are, really knows, and finds it sufficient." The fire made a small sound, settling. "That seems to me," Jeremiah Rourke said from the darkness, "like a very reasonable thing to want." She sat her watch until the sky began to lighten, and when she woke him in the pre-dawn gray, their hands brushed in the exchange of the coffee tin, and neither of them said anything about it. They rode hard the second day. The landscape changed as they moved east, the mountains receding behind them, the terrain opening into the high plains that rolled toward Pueblo with a kind of austere grandeur. Rourke set a pace that the horses could sustain over distance, and Louise matched it without complaint. They talked as they rode, not about the case, which they had analyzed as thoroughly as they could given the materials at hand, but about everything else. About the war, which he mentioned carefully, and she listened to without pressing. About her childhood in Missouri, which she described with the detached affection of someone who has understood their origins without being defined by them. About the particular character of Western towns, which both of them found simultaneously frustrating and compelling, the rawness of them, the sense of being in a place that was still becoming what it would eventually be, the way the rules were looser and the stakes were higher, and you could see yourself more clearly somehow, against all that open space. Around noon, they crested a low ridge and Rourke stopped his horse and pointed to a small collection of buildings in the middle distance. "Travelers' Way Station," he said, "run by a family named Acaffer, Samuel Acaffer and his wife Ruth. He was a freedman who came west after the war and bought this property in '69. He knows this road better than anyone. Do you trust him?" "With my life," Rourke said without hesitation. "He got me through a bad stretch about 14 months ago when I was riding this road in a bad state of mind and a worse state of preparation, and he fed me and told me some things I needed to hear." They rode down to the way station. Samuel Acaffer was a large, calm man of perhaps 45, with gray beginning at his temples and eyes that assessed and accepted in rapid succession. He welcomed them in, fed them a hot meal that Louise thought was one of the best things she had tasted in years, and took them into his confidence with the ease of a man who had learned to read people accurately, and had concluded that these two were worth reading favorably. He also told them something critically important. A man matching Donnelly's description had ridden through the day before with 4 armed companions, going north on the main road toward Cassidy Creek. Rourke and Louise looked at each other across the way station table. "He didn't wait for a telegram," Rourke said. "He was already moving." "Which means Fitch didn't warn him," Louise said, working it through. "He was already coming. He has been watching the situation directly." "How far ahead of us is Harlan?" Samuel Acaffer asked. "We sent the telegram 4 days ago," Louise said. "If he left Denver immediately, he could already be in Pueblo," Rourke said, "or on the road between Pueblo and Cassidy Creek." They looked at each other again. The shape of the problem had changed. Donnelly was already moving north. If Harlan was already moving south from Denver toward Cassidy Creek, they might be converging on the same territory. And Donnelly, if he reached the town before Harlan did, would have the power to suppress everything. "We need to go faster," Louise said. They left the way station with Samuel Acaffer's blessing, and a fresh supply of provisions he pressed on them over their mild protests, and they pushed harder in the afternoon. The horses were good horses, and they had been well rested and watered, and by late afternoon they had covered ground that Rourke thought would bring them to the main southern road, the road Harlan would be traveling on before nightfall. The meeting happened almost exactly where Rourke had predicted it would. They came over a rise, and below them on the main road, a coach was proceeding north at a measured pace, accompanied by two riders. Even from a distance, the coach had the official quality of government transport, a certain solidity of construction, a lack of unnecessary decoration. They rode down. Judge Harlan was a man of 60 with white hair and an expression of permanent judicial assessment, as though he was constantly evaluating the world for accuracy. He was not pleased to be stopped on the road. He was considerably less pleased when, in the first 5 minutes of conversation, it became clear what Louise and Rourke were telling him. But he was a serious man, and serious men listen when serious things are said. They stopped at the roadside for an hour. Louise laid out the documents on the lid of the judge's traveling case, which his driver provided as a flat surface, and she walked Harlan through them with the precise clarity of a bookkeeper presenting accounts. She showed him the evidence against Fitch. She showed him the evidence against Donnelly. She showed him the forged documents and explained, pointing to specific letter forms, why they were forgeries. Harlan listened. He asked 3 sharp questions. He looked at Rourke with the evaluating expression. Then he looked back at Louise. "You organized all of this in 8 days, he said. "I did. Whitmore's notes about Donnelly, how confident are you in their accuracy?" Sheriff Whitmore is a careful man who did not write things down unless he was confident in them. The corroborating details he gives, dates, amounts, the name of the Denver bank where the transactions occurred, are specific enough to be verifiable. Harlan nodded slowly. The marshal's involvement changes the legal dimension considerably. This moves from a territorial matter to a federal one. He was quiet for a moment. "I sent a communication to Donnelly's office last week informing him of my intention to travel to Cassidy Creek." "We know," Rourke said. "He is already on the road north. He will likely reach Cassidy Creek tomorrow." "Then we cannot allow him to arrive first and have time to manage what he finds there." Harlan turned to his driver. "We increase the pace. We travel through the night if necessary." He looked at Louise and Rourke. "You will accompany us." They accompanied him. It was the strangest night Louise could remember, riding through the darkness alongside a judge's coach on a road through a sleeping landscape, with the documents that might change multiple lives secured inside the coach. She was exhausted in the specific way that people become exhausted when they have been running on will and adrenaline for too long. The exhaustion that sits behind the eyes and makes everything slightly too vivid. Rourke rode beside her and they talked quietly, not about the situation, which had been discussed as much as discussing would help, but about small things. He told her about a dog he had owned for 3 years on the trail, a hound mix named Cicero who had been the best trail companion he could imagine. She told him about a summer she had spent at 16 helping her aunt in her millinery shop in St. Louis, and how she had discovered during that summer that she had an absolute gift for accounting and an absolute indifference to hats. He laughed at that, a real laugh, not a performance of amusement, and the sound of it in the nighttime air did something to her. "You laugh like you mean it," she said. "Most things either strike me as funny or they don't. I find no value in performing amusement. I find that very rare." "What do you find rare?" She thought about it. "People who mean what they do, who don't perform their way through things." She looked at the road ahead. "Most people are performing something most of the time. I include myself in that." "What do you perform?" It was a direct question, and she answered it directly. "Sufficiency. I perform being sufficient to myself. Being fine, not needing." She paused. "I have been doing it for so long that some of it has become real, which is both a success and a loss, depending on how you look at it." He was quiet for a moment. What would it feel like to stop performing it, even briefly? She thought about the gun lowered in the lantern light. She thought about sleeping in the canyon and feeling safe. She thought about the way his hands had not been raised in surrender but in honesty. "I think," she said carefully, "I might find out." He did not say anything to that. But in the darkness, he moved his horse slightly closer to hers, and they rode the rest of the night that way, close enough that their horse's breath made the same cloud in the cold air. They arrived in Cassidy Creek just after 9 in the morning, ahead of Donnelly. Louise was not certain how. They must have taken a faster route than his, or he had stopped longer, but the town was not yet disturbed by a marshal's arrival when Harlan's coach rolled down the main street. What the town was disturbed by was a fire. The smoke was visible from the edge of town, thick black smoke rising from the direction of the Hennessy Ranch. Louise felt her stomach drop. She looked at Rourke and he was already turning his horse. "Go," she said. "Go." He rode at a full gallop toward the smoke and she rode after him. And behind them she could hear Harlan shouting to his driver to continue to the sheriff's office and wait. The fire was not at the house. As they came over the hill that led down to the Hennessy property, they could see that it was the barn that was burning, and the house was intact, and there were people in the yard: Clara, Owen, 2 ranch hands with bucket lines, fighting to keep the flames from spreading. No one was hurt. The barn would be a total loss, but no one was hurt. Clara saw Louise and her face dissolved from terror into relief, and she ran across the yard and grabbed Louise by both hands as she dismounted. "He sent men," Clara said, breathless. "Fitch, 2 of them this morning before dawn. They threatened Owen. They said he needed to sign the deed transfer today or the next fire would be the house." Owen refused and they left, and then the barn. "It is all right," Louise said, holding Clara's hands. "It is going to be all right. Harlan is here." Clara stared at her. "The judge, he's here, right now, in town, with everything I gathered from Whitmore's office." She squeezed Clara's hands. "It is over, Clara, or it will be, very shortly." It was over within 3 hours, though the hours themselves were not calm. Judge Harlan established himself in the sheriff's office. Whitmore, from his bed in the adjacent room, provided endorsement and any information Harlan needed, and he received the full documentation and reviewed it with the focused efficiency of a man who had spent 30 years cutting through complicated situations to the truth beneath them. Donnelly arrived at 10:30 with 4 deputies. He came in with the confidence of a man who expected to control the room. He did not control the room. Harlan was in the room. Louise stood by the wall and watched Marshal Thomas Donnelly, a broad, florid man with a marshal's star and the careful eyes of a man who had learned to project authority without necessarily earning it, encounter the reality of Judge Harlan's presence and the weight of the documentation spread across the sheriff's desk. She watched him try 3 different approaches in rapid succession: indignation, then authority, then a sudden pivot toward cooperation. None of them worked on Harlan, who had seen them all before and was impervious. Donnelly was placed under federal custody by Harlan's authority. 2 of his deputies, confronted with the implications of what their marshal had been involved in, chose cooperation over complicity and provided statements. Gerald Fitch was found at his office in Cassidy Creek by Rourke and one of Harlan's men, and when they walked in, Fitch looked at Rourke for a long moment and then looked away and said nothing at all. Louise had expected him to be angry. He was not angry. He was defeated, which was different, the defeat of a man who had bet everything on a situation that had quietly turned against him while he was managing his other schemes. He was arrested and bound over to await trial. Donnelly was transported to Denver under Harlan's personal supervision. The forged documents were entered into evidence and cataloged. The land transactions that had been made under coercion were flagged for legal review. The Daniel Miller situation, his death and the forced sale of his family's property, was referred to federal investigators. It took the rest of the day and most of the following one. There was testimony given and statements taken, and a great deal of paper generated. And through it all, Louise sat at the desk in the sheriff's office and organized and assisted with the systematic patience that was her particular gift. Rourke moved through the official proceedings with a quiet competence that she found she was not surprised by, providing context and detail where needed, supporting Harlan's work without inserting himself into it unnecessarily. Whitmore, from his bed, said things through the open door that were occasionally useful and frequently wry, and always good-humored. By the evening of the second day, when the last of Harlan's paperwork was done, and the judge was preparing to depart with his prisoners, Louise was sitting outside the sheriff's office on the wooden bench against the wall, in the golden late light, with the profound bodily exhaustion of someone who has been running on necessity and is now, finally, permitted to stop. Rourke came out and sat beside her. They sat in silence for a while. The town moved around them, people going about their regular lives, largely unaware of the specific mechanics of what had happened in the last 48 hours, though the presence of Harlan's coach and the visible arrest of Donnelly had clearly generated significant local conversation. "It's done," he said. "It is done," she agreed. "How do you feel?" She considered this seriously. "Tired, satisfied, uncertain about what comes next." He nodded. "Whitmore won't be on his feet for another month. He asked me yesterday if I would consider coming back officially, taking the deputy position again." She looked at him. "What did you tell him?" "I said I needed to think about it." He turned his head to look at her. The late light was doing the same thing to his face that the lantern had done, illuminating it in amber, finding the lines and the history and the particular honesty of it. "I have been thinking about it. And the answer depends on certain things." She was aware of her heart doing something unhelpful. "What things?" He was quiet for a moment, with the stillness of a man who is assembling words carefully because they matter. "I told you something the first night," he said. "In this office. You told me many things. I told you I never expected you." She looked at his face. She thought about 2 years of a life that had been shaped by absence of Thomas, an absence of anything that replaced him, and the decision she had made somewhere in there to stop the particular kind of hoping that makes absence hurt. She thought about the way she had said it back to him that night. She had stopped expecting anyone. It had been true when she said it. She was no longer entirely sure it was true. "Jeremiah," she said. "Louise." "I stopped expecting anyone," she said. "I made a considerable investment in that not expecting. I built a very thorough life around it. I know. I am not sure I know how to undo it, or even if undoing it would be." "I'm not asking you to undo anything," he said. "I am asking if there is room, in whatever life you have built, for something that was not in the original plan." She looked at the street. She looked at Cassidy Creek in the evening light, the 8 buildings and the church that doubled as a schoolhouse, and the mill and the creek running fast and cold out of the mountains. She thought about Clara, who had written a letter containing a sentence that had set all of this in motion. She thought about the deputy's badge, which was in her pocket still, which she had not given back to Whitmore because no one had asked for it yet. She reached out and put her hand over his, which was resting on his knee. His hand turned under hers and held it. "I have been told," she said, "that the territory sometimes makes you feel like the world was made this morning just for you." "It does that," he said. "I think I would like to see more of it." He looked at her with something so unguarded in his face that she felt it like a pressure behind her sternum, warm and undeniable. He was not performing. He was entirely present, entirely real, and looking at her like she was something he had not expected and was actively grateful for. "Stay," he said, "not because of Whitmore or the badge or any of it. Stay because I would like to show you all of it, every canyon and every way station and every possible sky." She looked at him for a long moment. In the locked room inside her chest, the one with the good solid walls she had built and maintained with such care, something moved again. This time it did not stop moving. This time it kept going, slow and inexorable, like a door opening on well-made hinges. "I think," she said, "that I might need to write to Mr. Abrams in Abilene and tell him I won't be returning." Rourke smiled. It was not a large smile, but it changed his whole face, and she thought that she would like to see that change many times in many kinds of light. "I will take you back to the way station to thank Samuel Okafor properly," he said. "He would want to know how this ended." "I would like that," she said. They sat in the late light with their hands together, and the town moved around them, and the mountains to the west turned red and then purple and then a deep blue, and Louise Slater, who had stopped expecting anyone, sat beside the man she had not expected and allowed herself to feel the specific, terrifying, wonderful weight of something beginning. The following weeks moved with the particular combination of practical business and quiet revelation that Louise was coming to recognize as the characteristic rhythm of her new life. She moved out of the sheriff's office and took a room at the only boarding house in Cassidy Creek, run by a widow named Mrs. Hartwell, who had very strong opinions about respectability and very warm opinions about feeding people. Mrs. Hartwell's house had 4 rooms, a large kitchen that always smelled of something good, and a parlor with a window that looked west toward the mountains. Louise wrote to Mr. Abrams in Abilene. He wrote back with a generosity that touched her. He wished her well, said he had known the arrangement would not be permanent given her abilities, and provided a reference letter of such extravagant praise that she laughed when she read it, alone in her room, and then reread it twice more. She wrote to Thomas's creditors with a final accounting, which she had finalized before leaving Abilene, confirming that all debts were settled. That letter, brief and administrative, felt like closing a door she had been holding slightly ajar for 2 years, just in case she needed to go back through it. She did not need to go back through it. The town had questions about her. Small towns have questions about newcomers in general, and particularly about women who arrive alone and become involved in significant legal proceedings. Mrs. Hartwell answered most of these questions on her behalf with a combination of protective loyalty and masterful vagueness that Louise appreciated enormously. Rourke accepted Whitmore's offer and returned to his post as deputy, which meant he was visible and legitimate and present in the town in a way that mattered to people's sense of safety. He was also, Louise observed, very good at his job in the particular way that people are good at things they are genuinely suited to rather than merely trained and patient with people, when patience was called for, clear when clarity was needed, and able to read a situation developing at a distance in a way that suggested something almost like an instinct for order. They saw each other every day, sometimes in official capacities. She had been asked by Whitmore to continue helping with the office's administrative work while he recovered, and she had said yes because she was honest enough with herself to admit that she wanted a reason, and sometimes not. They walked in the evenings along the creek when the weather permitted. Cassidy Creek had a particular beauty in the late afternoon, the water moving fast and clear over rocks worn smooth, the cottonwoods along the bank still holding their gold into November. Rourke knew the names of the birds and the fish and the late-season wildflowers, and he shared this knowledge without pedantry, in the offhand way of someone who has simply accumulated attention to the world. She told him more about herself, gradually, in the way that you tell someone things when you discover that telling them things feels like being heard rather than being assessed. She told him about the specific quality of her loneliness after Thomas, which was not the mourning kind but the structural kind, the loneliness of a life that had been built around someone else's shape and now had a hole in it that she did not know how to fill with herself. She told him about the letter from Clara and how she had read it and felt, for the first time in 2 years, that she had a direction. She told him about holding the deputy's badge for the first time and the particular quality of weight in her hand. He listened. He listened with the full, unhurried quality that she had noticed on the first night, and that she understood now was not a technique, but simply who he was, a man who thought that what you said deserved the courtesy of being actually heard. He told her things too. He told her about St. Louis and his father, who had come from County Clare in Ireland in 1840, and built a modest life through work so relentless, it was almost religious, and how his father had instilled in him a particular conviction that a man's word was the only thing that outlasted him. He told her about the war with a care and a selectivity that she respected, not hiding it but choosing what to give, and what he gave was true. He told her about Alderson, the old sheriff who had hired him, who had been the first person in his adult life to say, "I trust your judgment," and mean it. He told her about the year after the accusations, riding out of Cassidy Creek, the way the road going out had felt like a defeat he hadn't chosen. "I thought about going back to Missouri," he said one evening, standing by the creek with the last of the light on the water. "I thought about it seriously. My mother was still living then. She died in the spring of '77. If she had been alive when this happened, I think I might have gone back to her. What stopped you?" I did not want to arrive at her door with nothing to show for the years out here except accusations and failure. She had watched me leave and she had been proud. I wanted to bring her something worth being proud of. He paused. "I suppose that sounds like pride of the wrong kind." "It sounds like love," Louise said, "wanting to be someone she could recognize." He looked at her with that unguarded expression that she had stopped trying to prepare herself for, because there was simply no preparing for it. In December, the Miller case reached a resolution that felt more like justice than Louise had been willing to hope for. The federal investigation confirmed that Daniel Miller's death was not accidental. He had been killed by men in Fitch's employ, and the evidence was sufficient to bring charges. His wife, Eleanor Miller, received notification that the land sale would be reversed and the property returned. She wrote a letter to Judge Harlan's office that Harlan forwarded to Louise, knowing she had been part of making it possible, and in it, Eleanor Miller said simply, "We did not think anyone would come. Thank you for being the people who came." Louise folded that letter very carefully and kept it. Christmas in Cassidy Creek was a modest affair by the standards of larger towns, but Clara Hennessy, who was constitutionally incapable of allowing a holiday to pass without transforming her home into something warm and excessive, hosted a dinner that included half the town and lasted until well past midnight. Louise sat beside Rourke at the long table in Clara's dining room and watched Clara and Owen move around their guests with the ease of people who had built a life together and knew it and were grateful for it. She thought about what it would feel like to have that, to have the ease of a life built with someone, to move through rooms with the confidence of someone who knows they are known. Rourke was watching her when she looked up. "What are you thinking?" he asked quietly under the noise of a dozen other conversations. "I was thinking about what I want," she said. She had decided to stop performing sufficiency, at least with him. "What do you want?" She looked at the table, at the candles and the dishes and the people talking with their hands. "I want to stop being someone who has stopped expecting. I want to expect again. I want," she paused because saying it was harder than thinking it. "I want what they have. I want to build something. I want it to be with you." He was very still for a moment. The conversations around them went on, unknowing. Then he said, "Louise Slater, I will spend the rest of my life making it easy for you to expect things." She looked at him. He was entirely serious, entirely present, and looking at her like she was the most important thing in his immediate field of vision, which included candles and Christmas and a room full of people. "You said you never expected me," she said. "I never expected you," he confirmed. "And I have been grateful for the surprise every single day since." She reached under the table and found his hand and held it, and he held hers back, and Clara caught Louise's eye from across the room and smiled the smile of a woman who had written a particular sentence in a particular letter and watched it arrive, over months, at exactly the destination she had hoped for. The new year came to Cassidy Creek cold and clear. Whitmore was back on his feet in February, moving carefully but mobile, and he formally reinstated Rourke as deputy in a brief ceremony that consisted mainly of Whitmore shaking Rourke's hand and saying, "It should have been done properly years ago," and Rourke saying he had no argument with that. The trials of Fitch and Donnelly proceeded through the late winter and into spring. Both men were convicted. Fitch received 8 years in federal prison. Donnelly, whose crimes were considered to include corruption of federal authority in addition to everything else, received 15. The convictions were reported in the Denver newspapers, and several of those reports mentioned evidence gathered and organized by a former deputy of Cassidy Creek, and declined to specify that the deputy in question was a woman who had been in Cassidy Creek for precisely 11 days when she gathered it. Louise read the report, noted the omission with equanimity, and moved on. In March, Rourke asked her to marry him. He did not do it with grand ceremony, which she had expected. He did not do it at dinner or in a public setting with people watching, which she had feared. He did it in the most characteristic way possible on a Tuesday afternoon, walking back from the post office along the creek, in the thin spring sunlight, stopping at a spot where the water ran fast over a smooth shelf of rock, and made a sound like a continuous, cheerful argument. He stopped walking and turned to face her and said, "I have been thinking about what you told me you wanted at Christmas. I have been thinking about it since then, and I want to say this plainly, because I think you deserve plain things." He looked at her with the full, direct quality she had come to love. "I love you, Louise. I did not expect to. I was not looking for it, and I was not in any particular state to receive it when it arrived, but it arrived anyway, and I have not known what to do with it except be grateful for it and try to deserve it. I am asking you to marry me. I am asking because I want to build that life with you, the one you described, and because every morning I wake up and think about what the day might hold, and you are the first thing I want to tell it to." She stood by the creek with the water arguing over the rocks and the thin March sun on her face. She had been a woman who stopped expecting anyone. She had been a woman who built a life out of sufficiency and called it enough. She had been a woman who arrived in a town she had never seen before with a deputy's badge she hadn't expected and a gun in her hand, and who had looked up to find a man with his hands raised in a gesture that was not surrender but honesty. "Yes," she said. "Jeremiah. Yes." He stepped forward and held her face in both hands with a gentleness that was, somehow, more overwhelming than any grand gesture could have been. He looked at her for a moment, the way you look at something that has changed the shape of your world. Then he kissed her, there by the creek in the thin spring light, and it felt exactly like what it was like, the end of a long, careful withdrawal and the beginning of something brave. They were married in April, in the Cassidy Creek church that doubled as a schoolhouse, with Clara Hennessy crying openly in the first row and Owen Hennessy handing her his handkerchief, with the practiced calm of a man who had expected this and prepared accordingly. Samuel Okafor had ridden 2 days to attend, which was the kind of thing that made Louise understand exactly why Rourke had trusted him with his life. And Samuel's wife Ruth brought a gift that was a quilt made from fabric she had been collecting for 20 years, pieced together in a pattern she said meant, in a tradition she carried from her mother's family, a good road and a safe return. Sheriff Whitmore stood up as witness. He was still walking with a slight limp from his fall, and he stood very straight and very formal throughout the ceremony, and then, afterward, allowed Clara to hug him, which he bore with the dignity of a man who has decided to permit things that would normally be too much. The Reverend, a methodical man named Fletcher who conducted the ceremony with the seriousness it deserved, asked Louise and Jeremiah to speak their own words, which was not universal practice, but which he encouraged when he thought the people in question had words worth saying. Louise said, "I came here not knowing what I was looking for. I was not looking for anything in particular, which is the state I had arrived at after a long time of looking and being disappointed. I had decided that what I had was sufficient, and I had made peace with that decision. I want to say now, in front of everyone here, that being sufficient is not the same as being whole. You have made me whole, Jeremiah, not by filling something that was empty, but by being someone worth opening myself to. I expect things now because of you. I expect mornings. I expect conversations. I expect the particular quality of being known. I expect a life that is more than I had allowed myself to hope for, and I find I am not afraid of it." Rourke said, I spent a long time in this world believing that being a person of good intent was sufficient protection against loss and difficulty, and I was disabused of this belief thoroughly and repeatedly. Several people in the small congregation laughed, gently. I learned instead that the world is not fair, and that fairness is not something that happens to you, but something you build, with the people willing to build it with you. You, Louise, are the bravest and most honest person I have ever known, and I want to spend the rest of my life being honest back. I will tell you when I am afraid. I will tell you when I am wrong. I will ride into any canyon with you, and I will find the stars for you when the dark is too thick to see through, and I will make certain that you never again feel like the only person in the room. There was not a dry eye in the building. Even Owen Hennessy, who prided himself on not crying, was occupying himself very thoroughly with his handkerchief. They left the church in the April sunlight to find that someone, Clara's doing, transparently, had decorated the outside with wildflowers, the first ones of the season, pushed up through the soil along the church wall, gathered and tied with practical ribbon. That evening, at the Hennessy Ranch, there was a dinner that lasted until midnight and a great deal of singing afterward, led by Samuel Ockhaffer, who had a voice that made the dark outside the windows feel warm and friendly rather than vast. Louise sat beside her husband, the word still having that slightly unreal quality of something newly arrived in the world, and looked at the room full of people and felt something she had forgotten was possible. She felt uncomplicated happiness. The kind that does not require management or containment or careful allocation. The kind that simply exists, whole and present, in a room where someone knows who you are. Rourke leaned toward her and said, quietly enough for only her to hear, "All right." "All right," she said, which was an enormous understatement, and they both knew it. The years that followed were not without difficulty. This is the nature of life in a territory that is still becoming what it will be. There are bad winters and dry summers, and the endless practical work of building a life from the available materials. Rourke's work as deputy meant he dealt with the ordinary human friction of a small town, disputes over property lines, occasional violence that had to be managed, the steady low-level complexity of being the person people called when their situations became too large for them to handle alone. Louise continued the bookkeeping work she had begun with Whitmore's office and expanded it. Several of the local ranches and merchants began using her services, and she was reliable and precise and fair, which in a small town is the kind of reputation that grows quietly and persistently. Clara and Owen's ranch survived and eventually prospered. The land that had been taken from the Miller family was returned, though Eleanor Miller ultimately chose not to return to Colorado with her children, finding they had built something new in Denver that worked for them. She wrote to Louise occasionally, and Louise wrote back, and this correspondence was one of the things Louise valued about her life, the thread of it connecting her to a justice that had been worth working for. Whitmore retired from sheriffing in 1881 and recommended Rourke for the position. The town council, which had learned something over the previous 3 years about what good judgment looked like in a sheriff, agreed without significant debate. The badge Rourke wore was larger and considerably less tarnished than the one Louise had been given, but she thought privately that the one she had worn for those 11 extraordinary days in 1878 had started everything, and she kept it in a small box on the dresser in their bedroom. In the spring of 1880, their first child was born, a boy they named James, for Rourke's father, whose full name had been James Jeremiah Rourke. James arrived into the world with a disposition of thorough alertness and the specific quality of attention that Louise recognized, with a warmth that startled her, as his father's. He looked at the world the way Rourke looked at the world, as though it was interesting and worth understanding and probably worth protecting. Clara, who arrived within an hour of the birth and was therefore among the first people in the world to hold James Rourke, declared him perfect, and then made a joke about naming the next one Charles or Catherine for her own father, which Louise told her was extremely presumptuous, and Clara said she was simply planning ahead, which was fair. The second child arrived 3 years later, in 1883. A girl this time, whom they named Margaret after Louise's mother, a woman Louise had admired for her quietly fierce practicality, who had died before seeing her daughter's life take the shape it finally had. Margaret arrived with a temper and a set of opinions that was apparent from her first week, which everyone agreed was entirely Louise's doing, and which Louise took as a compliment. By the time Margaret was old enough to walk and talk and declare positions on things, Cassidy Creek had changed considerably. The railroad had come, though not the Denver and Pacific. That company had collapsed in the wake of the convictions of Fitch and Donnelly, but a different line on different terms, negotiated with the landowners at fair prices. The town's population had grown. There was a proper school now, separate from the church. There was a proper newspaper, edited by a young man named Briggs who had come from Ohio and who had an admirable commitment to accuracy. Louise occasionally contributed pieces to Briggs's paper Practical Things, accounts of town business, a long piece she wrote in 1884 about the history of land use in the Cassidy Creek area that required her to do extensive research, and which she found she enjoyed with the specific pleasure of someone discovering a new way to do what she was already good at. Writing and bookkeeping were not so different at their core. Both were about finding the true shape of something and rendering it clearly. Rourke read everything she wrote and told her when it was good and why, and when it could be better and how, with the same honest quality that had defined every conversation they had ever had. She did the same for him when he was working on formal reports or correspondence with the territorial government, which had become increasingly necessary as Cassidy Creek's official standing grew. They were partners in the truest sense, not in the sense of performing partnership for an audience, but in the sense of two people who had each become more themselves because of the other's presence, more confident, more honest, more willing to be surprised. On a Sunday in October of 1884, Louise and Rourke walked along the creek in the late afternoon, which was still a practice they maintained, the way you maintain things that have been important to you from the beginning. The cottonwoods were gold again. The water moved fast and cold over the familiar rocks. The mountains to the west were carrying the first snow of the season on their peaks, white against a sky of a blue so deep it was nearly impossible. James was 7 and Margaret was 1, and both children were at the Hennessy Ranch with Clara, who had a gift for children that she deployed at every available opportunity, and who loved her role as their honorary aunt with a thoroughness that occasionally exhausted their actual parents. Louise and Rourke walked without speaking for a while, in the comfortable silence that is possible between people who have no need to fill space, because the space between them is already full of all the things that have been said and all the things that are understood without saying. "I have been thinking," Rourke said eventually. "About what?" "About the way it started. The night I walked into the sheriff's office and you had the Remington pointed at me." He glanced at her sideways. "I think about it sometimes. How different everything might have been. If I had been worse with evidence and believed the forgeries. If either of us had been slightly different people." He paused. "If you had not noticed the capital R," she laughed. The capital R changed everything." "The capital R changed everything," she agreed, and it was both true and funny in the way that the most important things often are, the enormous hinging on something small, the whole course of a life altered by a letter form. She stopped walking and he stopped beside her, and she looked at the creek, at the gold reflections of the cottonwoods in the moving water, and she thought about the woman she had been when she arrived here, careful and sufficient and alone in the structural way, and how she had said she had stopped expecting anyone and meant it. She expected things now. She expected mornings and conversations and the specific pleasure of being known. She expected to be surprised by her children, who were both full of surprises, and by her husband, who was less unpredictable but still, regularly, showed her new facets of himself. A kindness she hadn't seen before, an opinion she hadn't expected, a laugh that occurred at exactly the right moment. She expected the particular quality of the Colorado sky, which continued to do what Rourke had told her it would do on their first night camping in the canyon, making you feel, periodically, as though the world had been made this morning. She expected to be loved, which was perhaps the most radical thing of all because she had gone without it for so long that she had convinced herself the expectation itself was the problem. She had been wrong about that. The expectation was not the problem. The expectation held with the right person beside you was the whole point. "What are you thinking?" he asked beside her. "I am thinking that I am glad you came through that door." "So am I. I am thinking that I was wrong to stop expecting. I was being practical about something that shouldn't be practical. You were protecting yourself," he said. "That's not wrong. It was necessary once. It doesn't need to be necessary anymore." He put his arm around her, the way he had learned she liked, not pulling her toward him but simply present, letting her lean into it or not as she chose. She leaned into it. "I never expected you," he said softly. The same words he had said on the first night, but carrying 6 years of weight now. 6 years of mornings and arguments and children and canyon rides and stars identified, and evidence organized and justice served and dinners at Clara's and quiet walks by the creek. She turned to look at him. His face was everything she knew, the lines of it, the honesty of it, the particular way his eyes did the things she had not been able to name on the first night and could name now. It was love. It was simply and exactly love, unperformed, unqualified. "I had stopped expecting anyone," she said, as she had said then, but it meant something different now. Now it was not a statement of a life lived around absence. It was a statement of a past that no longer defined her, a chapter closed, superseded, transformed by everything that had come after. The creek ran fast over its rocks. The cottonwoods held their gold. The mountains carried their first snow. The sky above Cassidy Creek was the specific blue of a Colorado October afternoon in 1884, and in the morning there would be children to collect from Clara's and breakfast to make and a town to serve and a life to continue building from the available materials, which were, Louise thought, more than sufficient. They were more than sufficient. They were, in fact, everything. She held his hand on the walk back, and they talked about James and what he might want for Christmas, and about a rancher east of town who had written to Rourke about a boundary dispute, and about whether Clara's prediction that Margaret would be the stubborn one was turning out to be accurate. It was. And about the astronomy book that Rourke had ordered from a Denver printer, and that had arrived last week, and that he had been reading aloud to James at bedtime in the evenings. "He asked me last night what the stars are made of," Rourke said. "I told him what I know, which is not everything." "What did he say?" "He said he wanted to find out the rest." Rourke smiled. "I told him that was exactly the right response." She smiled too. "He has your instinct for it, for wanting to understand things." "He has your determination," Rourke said, "which is better." Louise thought that was probably right. And she thought also that the two things together, curiosity and determination, would serve their son very well in the world he was inheriting, which was still, in many ways, a world being made, a territory becoming something, a place where the rules were still being written, and the sky was still doing impossible things with light in the evenings, and where it was still possible, if you were paying attention, to walk into a room and find something you had never expected. Or for something you had never expected to walk in and find you. In the end, she thought, it came to the same thing.